Thanks very much, John. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Wynn Medical Services Proprietary Limited for generously sponsoring today's events. Ray Williams, the State Minister, says we're the best multicultural society in the world, and I can tell you that we hope that's true, but it requires ongoing effort by all concerned in Australia to make sure the cohesion that we all want is achieved. Now, I'm delighted to facilitate the second in Affinity's Middle East panel discussions. As you can tell, we're recording this because we've got some expertise here that is, when it's brought together, is extremely valuable to lift the consciousness of all of us about the issues under discussion. So today we'll be hearing from two very knowledgeable speakers, Dr. Noah Bassil from Macquarie University and Tarek Al-Issawi from the New South Wales Police Force. Noah Bassil's academic interests include global political economy, colonialism and post-colonialism, and the political economy of uneven north-south relations. He's published on a range of topics, on a range of topics associated with colonialism and post-colonialism, and most recently published a book titled The Crisis of the Sudanese Post-Colonial State, which re-examines the origins of the conflict in Darfur by contextualising events in Sudan within broader regional and international patterns of politics, economics and culture. He's currently researching into the global, regional and national power relations that have emerged following the Arab uprisings. Tarek Al-Issawi currently works as a projects officer at the New South Wales Police Force with a focus on multi-ethnic affairs. Tarek is the point of contact for the New South Wales Police Force's engagement with multicultural media outlets. He addresses ignorance every day. Tarek is often featured in multicultural media outlets such as SBS Arabic, Radio 2ME, Quran Kareem Radio and Iraqi TV as a spokesperson for the New South Wales Police Force for the Arab and Muslim communities in New South Wales. Tarek has covered the 2003 Iraq War, the war in the Balkans, the Lebanese-Israeli conflict and terror attacks in Saudi Arabia, Yemen and the Persian Gulf. He is fluent in Arabic and his time in the Middle East has given him valuable insight into the workings of power structures and conflicts in the region. His work is featured in leading publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, among others. Today, our panellists will be discussing the Saudi-led war in Yemen, the proxy war no one wants and no one can win. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Noah and Tarek. We're going to ask these gentlemen to speak for a 10 or 20 minutes or so. Then I'll ask some questions and then we'll invite you to ask some questions in a Q&A style, and we hope to wrap up by 1:30. So Noah, you're going to start off for us.
Thank you very much, Quentin. I'd also like to thank Affinity for inviting me to speak today on this topic, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land as well and pay my respect to their elders past and present and to any Indigenous people who are here today. The last time I spoke for Affinity, which is about 3 and a bit years ago, I spoke on the crisis in Iraq, a country riven by conflict for a number of decades now, as we all well know, and a conflict that had often been and very commonly represented as a conflict between Shia and Sunni Iraqis. Before that, and leading into my work on Iraq, I had worked, as Quentin mentioned, on the conflict in Darfur, a conflict that had widely described as a conflict between Arabs and Africans. In both those cases, the common perception was that these were age-old animosities or differences that were playing out in contemporary times. In a sense, there is an element of that that's being portrayed in the Yemen conflict. I'd like to challenge that a little bit to begin with, to talk about how the crisis in Yemen has much deeper historical roots. And in fact, the sectarianism, which dominates some of the commentary around the Yemeni conflict and the proxy conflict that is occurring at another level, or at the regional and global level, affecting Yemen, is of far recent origins. Recent headlines that have put Yemen in the media for a very brief moment described, from a UN report, describes Yemen as now the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And the statistics that are coming out from Yemen do present a really desperate situation. 22 million people out of a population of 27 million in desperate need of aid. 8 million people have no access to food. Every 10 minutes a child under age of 5 dies from preventable disease. 80% of the population suffer from extreme water shortages. The situation in Yemen is incredibly dire. It doesn't receive a great deal of attention, and our knowledge of what's happening there is quite sparse, to say the least. And thank you, Tarek, for making this the topic for today. And partly, as Tarek will explain, I'm sure, it was to highlight the extent of this problem and to give us some background on what's actually happening, or some information. Now, as I said, my own work really does challenge this idea around difference as being responsible for conflict. But partly that's I think I take a philosophical position on this, that if difference is the cause of conflict, then the only solution to difference is to draw lines between people. That's both unworkable and also a very pessimistic understanding of the human condition. Things like ethnicity, race, religion, culture, for me, and this is a quote from a senior scholar who has been working on this area for 40 years, are not explanations of conflict. They are things that require explanation. In every society in the world, differences exist between people based on a range of identities. But most people in the world live harmoniously. So difference itself isn't an explanation for conflict. In fact, in Yemen, up until quite recently, probably in the 1980s or 90s, Shia and Sunni worshipped in the same mosques. There was a great deal of intermarriage between them, and historically, Sunnis and Shia moved across the religious frontiers depending on marriage, familial relations, geographical movement, socioeconomic reasons. So this idea that this age-old sectarian conflict explains what's happening in the country and in the region is very problematic. We also have to remember Iran was a major supporter of northern Yemen, the so-called Shia region, during the 1980s, during the Cold War, for ideological reasons, not sectarian ones. That's not to say sectarianism isn't evident in Yemen. It certainly is, and we have to recognise that people are fighting today and reflecting their grievances and other issues through sectarian identities. 53% of Yemenis are Sunni, 45% are Shia, and they're largely geographically concentrated in the north for the Shia, and in the south and west for the Sunni. As I said, the fluidity is a major issue. Now, one of the reasons, or the reason I've titled this presentation A Tale of Two Yemens, is that whilst that's one reflection of the conflict, there are all these other Yemens, divisions, that I think have been overlooked in trying to explain the conflict through the sectarian lens. There is the old guard versus advocates of change, and Albert Harani, the late, great historian of Arab culture, said that almost all conflicts in the Middle East can be explained through conservatives versus advocates of change. There's the rich versus poor, and I'll go through some of the inequality statistics in Yemen. There's the urban versus the rural. There's the young versus the old. the North versus the South, and then there's the issue of gender, which will become evident in terms of inequalities there as well. So when we're talking about two Yemens, in fact, the divisions that are, I think, responsible for the conflict in this country are quite complicated and run across a whole range of different aspects of society. And that's important for me because, as the title of the talk suggests, this is about proxy war. But from my perspective, you can't have a proxy war unless you've got a local war to begin with. International actors come in and manipulate or take advantage of or play into what is happening at the local context. So unless there's a conflict to begin with, the Iranian, Saudi, American, European, Egyptian, Turkish dimensions really don't matter very much. They matter very much because we have this very complicated, fractured and problematic society in which they are operating. So prior to 1960, and I'll go through this very quickly so that I don't run out of time, but Yemen's only a very recent construct. You know, really, when we talk about Yemen, we're talking about 2 or 3 geographical areas. Aden was under the British up until 1967. The protectorates were a loose amalgam of societies that were bound together in treaty to the British, and then North Yemen was under the Ottomans, and then independent from 1918 through to the 1960s. Then in 1968, there was the formation of 2 separate Yemens. North Yemen, which was loosely allied with the West, and South Yemen, which was in the Soviet sphere and had taken on a Nasserist position internationally in the 1970s and 80s. And then that's Yemen today with its geographical provinces highlighted. So Yemen, as we understand it today, we talk about it as if it has some eternal history, actually only comes into existence in 1990. It's a state of less than 3 decades age. So it's a very young, and I guess in some ways all states are natural, but it's incredibly unnatural in the sense that it doesn't have a history as a unified area. And that's part of the 2 Yemens that we have to take into account. It's a population of 27 million. Incredibly, the population has more than doubled in 28 years since unification. And of course that creates problems. You've got to have a huge amount of economic growth if you're going to provide for that sort of incredible population increase. 46% of the population are under 15. So you've got this huge demographic bubble. For those of you who sort of read about the Arab Spring, one of the major causes of the Arab Spring, as a number of people identified, was the huge demographic bubble. You know, all these young people with aspirations and hopes that were not being met, rising up. And that certainly was an element of the Arab Spring, as it was in Yemen in 1990. The capital is Sana'a. There's a population of 2 million. It's the only city in Yemen that has a population more than 1 million. So this is a country that's largely still rural. As the last point makes clear, it's the worst, according to the UN and a number of other international organisations, Yemen is the worst country in the world for gender inequality. It has no female parliamentarians. It has the largest pay divide, the lowest female literacy rates, and the youngest average age of marriage. So there's immediately, we've got a number of 2 Yemens emerging, divided Yemens that are really, I think giving us a sense of the background problems that this country is facing. It's a poor country. It ranks 141 in the world in terms of its economic performance. The government debt is 83% of GDP, so it's an indebted country. It doesn't reach the heavily indebted countries, but it's right up there. Its trade deficit in 2015, the most recent statistics, was $6.44 billion. That is, it's importing $6.44 billion worth of goods more than it's exporting. And that, as we know, is unsustainable and creates a whole range of problems. 75% of state revenues are derived from oil exports, provide very little employment opportunity, and as we see in many states, what people call the resource curse. It means that the state doesn't rely on civil society for its income. It relies on it from export revenues. They're the exports and imports. The only reason I really wanted to put this up is that we see here, and this is a problem with many underdeveloped countries, is that Yemen is exporting crude petroleum and importing refined petroleum. So its natural resources are going out, it's importing value-added resources. Not good for the economy and certainly reflective of the underdevelopment of the country. And it's also importing food products. For a country with a rich agricultural sector, to import food products is again reflective of how underdeveloped and impoverished this country is. And you know, we have a sense here that the impact of policies since unification have just increased the disparities between, or the economic problems that this country faces. According to a World Bank report in 2014, now these are many of the policies that the World Bank is talking about are policies that actually the World Bank promoted in, so this is a sort of mea culpa. Development policies may have led to greater inequality. The disparity between different areas and socioeconomic groups have widened. Inequality is worse. And in the report it says low income and high inequality in the Republic of Yemen. Later on it says that Yemen is right at the bottom of the list of Arab countries in terms of inequality. So we have another two Yemen emerging. A poor country with a large impoverished population and inequality. 50% of the population live on less than $2 American a day. Unemployment rate is at 18%, but unemployment's measured on the number of people who are actively looking for work. In a country that's largely rural and agricultural, many of those people aren't measured in those stats. So some unofficial claims are the rate is as high as 60%. The top 10% of the population top 10% of the population own 50% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% share 13% between them. Now remember, this is a very poor country, so they're not sharing out a lot. And the richest 1% own over 15% of the country's wealth. So the inequalities in Yemen are clearly, I think for me, as we saw in the Arab Spring, creating grievances. 50% of Yemenis unemployed or employed or involved in the agricultural sector. So we're getting this sense of the sort of disparities, socioeconomic disparities that are very, very evident in this country. So this is the sort of, I guess, the demographic, the, I guess, social level issues, economics and social issues that are evident in Yemen, and they create huge problems. Yemen, as I said, was historically divided. It has a colonial past, and that colonial past creates a number of problems in its own right. And I don't have time to go into them now, but one of the things that happened here was that these two areas became even more separated as a result of the colonial history. In the 1950s, or by the 1950s, what is today the southern part of Yemen was heavily influenced by anti-colonialism, and this was influenced by Nasserism. And to counter this, the British, who ruled over this area, had influence over this area, empowered tribal chiefs and traditional leaders as a way of preventing the anti-colonial movement from challenging its rule, but also from moving this part of the country over to socialist political position. Now that's had a legacy as well, and as I said, one of the divides is between the old guard or the traditionalists and the new urban intellectuals or progressives. And in a sense, this is a historical legacy of the colonial period as much as it is anything else. the current conflict in Yemen is not the first that we've seen. The years between 1968 and 1990, when the two Yemens existed side by side, were a period of incredible instability, both between the two Yemens and within each of them. There were a number of civil conflicts, assassinations of political leaders, cross-border skirmishes, and as one scholar suggested, there were a total of 8 civil wars and 16 coup attempts in this period. And because of the context, international context, and the local politics at play here, the two Yemens were incorporated into the Cold War as well. So all those dynamics that played out in the Cold War were very heavily influential in Yemen as well. But as the Cold War waned, the two Yemens came together, or the leaders of the two countries came together, and unification took place in 1990. Now, I think what I'm hoping to draw out in this very brief period is that whilst the country was unified, it wasn't really. This is a country with a huge amount of disunity and a lot of internal conflict. One scholar remarked that unification has brought together two of the world's poorest countries. He goes on to say elsewhere that in the result of this is that two of the poorest countries in the world have come together to create one of the poorest countries in the world. So it didn't lead to an improved economic situation for Yemen. In fact, in the 1990s, a period where there was some optimism for Yemenis around the possibilities for an improvement of life, mainly external factors impeded that. In particular, in 1991, the Saudis expelled 1 million Yemenis from the country because of Yemen's support for or opposition to US intervention in Iraq. That meant there were 1 million people whose repatriation of wealth was no longer flowing into Yemen, and had a huge impact on Yemen's economy. US also ceased its aid, and the US mission withdrew from Yemen in 1991. And we see a number of civil wars break out in 1990 and 2004. And in 2011, Yemen is one of the sites of the Arab uprisings, which go on for a number of months. Despite attempts by Abdullah Saleh to brutally repress the movement, he's still swept from power in 2012. So hopefully this gives you a sense that yes, we can talk about the proxy war, but I think for me, more significantly, is that even if the international actors were to remove themselves from what was happening in Yemen, there is a great deal of internal conflicts and grievances that play out in numerous ways that still make this country one that is deeply divided and one that is in need of a great deal of political, economic and cultural development if it's going to move forward. And I think I finish on that note. Thanks.